Good evening, everybody. This is Nevin, your host of New Ideas. With me is one of the friends of the show, is becoming a recurring guest, Professor Matt McManus, who's a university lecturer in Canada, as well as soon to be in Spelman College here in the USA in Georgia. Matt is a prolific author and lecturer and podcast guest. His recent book, Liberal Socialism, is definitely worth a read. Matt is a fellow anti-totalitarian. He is, I would say, a bit of a pragmatist. He's not an ideologue. He's not a tanky Marxist-Leninist socialist, if you will. He is for a more social democratic mixed economy. Is that a fair description of your views in a nutshell?
Yeah, I would characterize myself as a liberal socialist, meaning that I would advocate for the kind of political system that you would see in Sweden, Norway, Denmark, but on the left end of that. So some of your listeners might be familiar with Olof Palme, the kind of iconic Swedish prime minister during the 1970s, leader of the Swedish Social Democrats. He'd probably be the closest analog to a politician, I'd say, represents my views.
Okay, well, very good. Yes, I remember Olof Palme. I'm going to be 51 next month, so I do vaguely remember him even when I was a young conservative in the 1980s. And, I have my critiques, but,
of course,
but at the same time, when people examine my writings and my policy proposals, my views tend to be very syncretic. It's a mixture of civic nationalism, but that's radical departure. I call it radical civic nationalism because I break with Reaganomics in many ways. I call for its repeal over a 5-year period so businesses can adjust. I become a very staunch, stout, almost obsessive critic of unchecked capitalism. I have argued in my writings, my books, this show, that unchecked capitalism is perhaps the preeminent national security threat of the free world. And you don't see a lot of anti-communists saying that in very unequivocal, very almost harsh sounding terms. I'm for a strong national defense, but obviously I also look at the other side and I say the defense contractors here in the United States bilk the taxpayer of so much money, and then yet the right will say, well, we can't pay for these legitimate social programs of care, but yet somehow the Defense Department fails multiple audits. So my syncretic view is you could have a strong national defense, but you could also take into account the evidence made by people like yourself on the left that you have a lot of these abuses in contracting that we need to take a look and then kind of create a new ideology, a new way of analysis and looking at things. But one of the things that absolutely sucks about the United States is our political discourse is horrible on all sides. Everything is so binary, it's ridiculous. I'm jealous of the people in Europe and elsewhere who, like my girlfriend, she's from Peru, and one of her cousins lives in Spain, and he was recently visiting. And he was, every European I've met, maybe it's just because I'm fortunate, I don't know, but they all seem to be very pragmatic and practical. Here, everything is binary and ideological, and it's deeply frustrating. So what is your take on the discourse in Canada as well as the United States? Because we're going to be talking about conservatism and how it relates to Trump. Because I would argue that Trumpism, as it actually governs, is mostly according to the so-called conservative tradition. He's really the apotheosis or high point or culmination of really Reaganism. So before we get into the meat and potatoes, what is you as a Canadian, what is your impression of political dialogue and discussion and debate here in the United States? Are we outliers?
Well, it just doesn't really exist anymore, does it, right? I think we saw that very transparently during the nominal debates between the different presidential candidates last year, right? There was one debate where Joe Biden just seemed pretty much to be in another world at that point, and Trump just spent his time ribbing at him and ribbing at him and ribbing at him, and came away looking a lot more impressive, but only by contrast. And then we had another debate where a presidential candidate started talking about how Haitian migrants were eating dogs and cats, and you just kind of think, this guy's crazy, right? I mean, he's just completely out to lunch, right? And that was before things started to descend further. So when that's the kind of status of discourse between candidates for president of the United States, I don't need to go into any kind of deep minutia in order to justify my claim that there's a problem. It's pretty self-evident, right? In terms of how it compares to other countries, look, every country has been subjected to various forms of cross-polarization brought about by social media. Canada, where I'm from, is not inoculated against that. We've seen some pretty odd things happen there recently. But I would say that it hasn't reached the threshold, really not nearly the threshold that we've seen here in the United States. Just to give one example, there was an election recently in Canada, highly framed by the recent Trump tariffs. And there was a populist-ish conservative candidate that had a pretty good chance of winning. He ended up losing, but it was thought that he would win for quite a long time. And somebody just asked him, almost on a lark, what's going to happen if you lose the election? Will you accept the results? And he just looked at the guy like he was crazy and said, of course, I'm going to accept the results. This is Canada, right? If I lose, we lose, and we try again later. And having lived in this country for a few years now, there was just something that was brazenly refreshing about that little blast from home. Because I could think to myself, yeah, I don't exactly like Pierre Poilievre. I would, without a doubt, never vote for him. But at least he has the decency to admit that if he loses, they're going to try to come up with a more attractive platform next time, because that's how democracy is supposed to work.
No, absolutely. With America, from my impression, the country used to be much more pragmatic. I've had a guest by the name of Pat Choate. He's an economist and author. He was Ross Perot's vice presidential running mate back from the 1996 election. He has done a lot of consulting work, a lot of work with the federal government, state governments, local governments. He was a big name back in the 1980s, 1990s, into the early 2000s. He's worked with individuals like Michael Lind, who I'm sure you're familiar with, and many others. And, he remembers a time, and he's been on the show a number of times, and he remembered a period in the United States, and really throughout our history, that America, yes, was ideological, but there was always a very strong practical, pragmatic strain in American politics. Really, that started to go out the window starting in the 1980s and thereafter, and that's been egged on by what I've termed and others have termed by Conservative Incorporated. Now, for those of you who are just joining the program for the first time, my political roots are in the political right. I was a Reagan conservative. I moved towards John Birch Society, actually was a member. I don't know if I told you this or if you read that. And then I became a libertarian, even more libertarian in many ways. And then I started to do a shift. It's a very long story, starting throughout the 2000s, culminating in 2008, and just gradually by 2012, I just basically jettisoned Reaganomics, Reaganism. I saw that conservatism.
2008 did that to a lot of people. I can assure you.
Yeah, I remember having discussions after work with one of my colleagues who was a disillusioned conservative. And, I like conservative goals. I like, as I interpret them at least, meaning entrepreneurship, strong local communities, or strong national defense, patriotism, and whatnot. But look, like the Communist Party USA, global communism, totalitarian socialists, fascists, national socialists, they'll label themselves opportunistically and use legitimate grievances and emotional issues to cover up an unpopular agenda. And this was the subject of my last essay. Conservatism Incorporated has done the same thing. When we take a look at the roots of what today is modern conservatism, so-called, I might add, it really is rooted in social Darwinism. It's rooted in an aspect of classical liberalism, individuals like Thomas Malthus in England, Here in the United States, William Graham Sumner, the Reverend Conwell, which I believe it's called the Cross of Diamonds speech, and others. And I talk about it in my last essay on my Substack page called Wilderness of Mirrors. And individuals like that, philosophers, clergymen, politicians, business people who espouse those views, when you look at the views of Richard Hanania, who, by the way, was on the board of Project 2025, when you look at Ayn Rand, when you look at Milton Friedman, who said sincerity is an overrated virtue, when you look at Ben Shapiro, who says that empathy is generally bad for politics, you start to see an intellectual continuity. And you see that to an observer like me, how can you have the conservative virtues of strong local communities, Norman Rockwell America, a strong stand against, quote, socialistic totalitarianism abroad, whether China or the neo-Bolshevik regime of Putin or Cuba or Venezuela or wherever, or a strong national defense, a strong military, more entrepreneurship, when your intellectual heroes are all social Darwinists who do not value sentimentalism, families. Really what they want to conserve is unchecked capitalism and a very malicious, malignant form. When you look at even what they talk about, and you've written extensively about this on Jacobin, and I've learned quite a bit about you, and of course I dig into the quotes to look at the context and their works and whatnot, and it's really not a conservative force. It's an atomizing force that I know. One of my late friends, Kenny Stoltman, was a communist. He was an activist in the Party of Communist USA before he left, which was a hardline splinter from the CPUSA. And he was instructed by Angelo, the chairman of that organization. He says, the propaganda writes itself. He says that just show them what let's say a Richard Hanania or Ron DeSantis or Mike Johnson and others, for example, saying about people are lazy or on Medicare, they're just sitting and play video games. Just show them what they think about you, what they really think about you. And you'll see that we care about you and we want to liberate you. We're the better choice while they're your oppressors. Well, before he left the party, he defected. He recruited about 3 or 4 people successfully based on that strategy that he was told to do. And that's the thing. So when I started to look at this, and I start to look at Trump is not a populist, not as I understand it, because he misdiagnoses the elites. And misdiagnosis and manipulation is another hallmark of Conservative Incorporated. When you look at the memos in the Reagan Library of Lee Atwater, Paul Weyrich, who actually did kind of a U-turn eventually on some of the Reaganomics issues as he saw the negative effects of Reaganomics. But Paul Weyrich, Lee Atwater, Ralph Reed, and others literally will say, we got to separate you from your labor unions. You're socially conservative, but economically progressive within a capitalist framework. And we can't win the populist democratic vote by just trickle-down economics. We have to use issues of law and order, abortion, crime, Second Amendment issues, and we're going to say the Democrats are all against that, those left-wing Democrats. It was a strategy of manipulation. Why? Because they wanted, as they've said, they want to cover up their actual agenda. If you've seen the movie 2073 or the sci-fi series Incorporated or the movie from my parents' age when they were young, Rollerball, which came out in the 1970s, really the end game, and this is a very controversial point, but I pointed out in my essay, of modern so-called conservatism is a corporatocracy fused with techno-authoritarianism. And that's really what I've come to believe. So I want you to give your thoughts about that. Is this just left-wing alarmism, or do I have a point here? What does your research tell you?
No, I think you definitely have a point there, and I don't think that you need to speculate about this. All you need to do is read Peter Thiel's writings, Curtis Yarvin's writings, and they argue for something that looks a lot like what you're calling for, right? And these aren't just idle intellectuals any longer, right? Curtis Yarvin has shaped the mindset of people like J.D. Vance, who's now the vice president of the United States. So really, he's made it big, as they say. But I think we have to be fairly precise here about the kind of ideological contours of what we're talking about. So as a liberal socialist, I'm broadly speaking critical of most aspects of contemporary capitalism. Not necessarily markets, though. I think that there's a place for markets in a well-functioning social democratic or democratic socialist society. But I think that even within the parameters of defenders of capitalism, there's gradations. And I think that this has been poorly understood. So I'm very good friends with Aaron Ross Powell, who was once of the Cato Institute, now identifies as a left libertarian. And he put it very well, so I'll quote him. He said that many people decided to become libertarians because by and large, they were committed to essentially a liberal project where they saw the state as the single biggest barrier to the achievement of human equality and human flourishing, right? They didn't like the way that the state restricted the lives of migrants. They didn't like the way that the state restricted the right of people to form unions. They didn't like the way that the state interfered with people who just wanted to run a little taxi business, but they couldn't do that without a lot of different regulatory hoopla, right? And he said what he realized over time, especially when Trump came to power, is that there was a large wing of the libertarian movement that felt very differently, right? To them, the biggest problem with the state was precisely that the state did too much to secure human equality and the conditions of human flourishing. And then if you got rid of the state in some respects, but empowered it in others, this would allow a more natural and organic kind of social hierarchy to appear. And the strong would rule over the weak, the way that they were supposed to, right? And Aaron told me that was roughly when he realized that it was time to reevaluate some of the deep convictions that he had about the inexorability of capitalism's benefits, at least as it appears in the United States, and to recognize that many of the people who professed to believe the same thing that he did actually had very different goals and aspirations in mind. And if you want to kind of make this even analytically clear than the anecdote I relayed, F.A. Hayek has a very good essay called Why I'm Not a Conservative, which is a favorite essay of mine. Now, I'm naturally extremely critical of Hayek in many respects, although I'd like to point out he endorsed things like universal health care for all and unemployment benefits, right, which in some ways would actually put him on the left end of the Democratic Party at this point, there with Bernie leading the charge for universal health care. But in Why I'm Not a Conservative, he says, look, fundamentally, I am a liberal. And the reason I believe in capitalism is because I think that capitalism is the best system to secure freedom for all and also maximal utility for all. And the two things are aligned with one another, right? Capitalism is very efficient and will make everyone better off in the long run. And he says that's very different than conservatives who believe that ultimately there are, to use this terminology, recognizably superior people, or we can even say recognizably superior groups in society. And these groups are entitled to dominate, or people are entitled to dominate over everyone else. And they see capitalism less as a means of securing freedom for all and flourishing for all, and more as a means of, again, sorting people into where they belong on the hierarchy. And Hayek didn't really want that much to do with that, at least in some moments, right? And I think that this is a very sharp bit of analysis, and it tells you a lot about the present moment we find ourselves in. Because right now, what we see in power are people who genuinely do not care very much about how the system operates for the vast majority of people out there whom they consider unworthy anyway, right? They are concerned that those they consider recognizable superiors or deserving get everything that they're entitled to. And frankly, as far as everyone else is concerned, they can go fuck off.
Exactly. And that's exactly it. And look, I defend capitalism. I'm for, to be specific, the pre-Reagan capitalism, which exists in the United States. And there is a diversity in the conservative movement. You have Oren Cass of American Compass. You have a couple of others, Sohrab Ahmari, I mean, who is, I guess you could say he's still conservative in many ways, certainly socially conservative, is still a supporter of capitalism. He's become more of a critic of American foreign policy, of course, without embracing, being an apologist now, right? Apologist for totalitarian geopolitical adversaries. But, I would argue that at least. But they're not really in power, those individuals. The individuals in power are what you see in the Trump administration. And it's really the Project 2025 people. It's a portion of the NatCon movement. And I got to tell you, I was having a discussion with a writer for Compact Magazine, Juan Rojas. I don't know if you know the name.
No.
No?
No, I've written for Compact before. Really idiosyncratic magazine, and naturally I don't agree with a lot of what they publish, but I do appreciate their ecumenicism when it comes to platforming interesting voices across the country. But I've never read his essays, no.
Yeah, he's a social democrat. He's pretty syncretic in his views. He's a skeptic of American foreign policy, but he has no sympathy for the tankies either. He's a foreign policy realist. He has a journal on Substack. Was it Social Democracy with Populist Characteristics or something or another? Yeah, interesting guy. And we were talking about, and there is tremendous disappointment amongst a portion of the national conservatives that are kind of believers in the realignment right, who are outside the Trump administration or loosely affiliated with them. And we were talking about that. There's just a lot of disappointment in certain circles, without mentioning names, because the Trump administration had basically shit-canned the idea of the realignment. Now, Trump, even in his earlier rhetoric, whether we believed it or not, obviously he doesn't believe it, but at least as far back as at least the late 1980s, he was critical of Reaganomics. He was critical of our trade deficit. He was critical of aspects of the 1986 Reagan tax bill. When he meant drain the swamp in his first campaign, he meant eviscerating, or not eviscerating, but limiting Wall Street and multinational corporate influence in American politics and the influence of the super wealthy donors. I mean, he said a lot of these things, and he got a lot of heavy critiques from a lot of his now allies. Mark Levin hated Trump. I remember it all too well. He would rage in that annoying nasally voice that he has.
So did Ben Shapiro back in the day.
Exactly, Ben Shapiro and others, and they just attacked Trump as a socialist. Glenn Beck did the same thing. And after their first term, they absolutely loved Trump. They loved Trump because he basically became Reaganism without the smile and without the charm. It was really the apotheosis of Reagan.
Or the movie star Good Looks. Let's be clear about that also.
I'm sorry?
Or the movie star Good Looks.
Yeah, yeah, true enough. And really, do you think Trump and his administration is the culmination of really the sort of social Darwinism of the Reaganomics crowd? I mean, for example, I can quote, what was his name? George Gilder, who said that with the economic dislocations of the 1980s, addressing this, he says, well, now the poor and middle class will have the spur of the boot of poverty to help lift themselves up by their bootstraps. And that was not uncommon with rhetoric from individuals close to the Reagan administration. And now, what is Trump doing? It's like whenever I go on social media, I look at people on the left as well as more of the dissident right. I mean, it seems a more perfect union for those of you out there who want a good source for following all of this deregulation and labor-hating frenzy that's been going on. Check out More Perfect Union. Yes, they're on the left, but they document their information very well and very carefully. I mean, I think Trump is just, I agree with Alan Lichtman, who said in his latest podcast that Trump is really the culmination of modern conservatism. It really is. I mean, what do you think? What's your readout on that?
Yeah, I mean, there's been various different theories that have been floated on this, and there are two broad schools of thought. One is what's called the discontinuity or break theory, right, which basically holds that Trumpism is some kind of break from what came before, whether in the Republican Party or the broader conservative movement in the United States. And, you know, the argument is that, you know, you had the party of Reagan, you had the party of Eisenhower that got co-opted by all these MAGA populists who had always existed on the fringe, but suddenly became mainstream, and they kind of reinvented the Republican Party on their own in their own image. And certainly this is the argument that's favored by, frankly, many conservative never-Trumpers, right, who feel that their party has been stolen from them. It is not the view that I subscribe to, right? I favor what's sometimes referred to as the continuity thesis. Basically, the idea that, yeah, obviously Trumpism is a mutation or evolution of what American conservatism was. Everything changes, right? But evolution does not mean break, right? It means that something that was one thing before has now changed a little bit over time and become something else while retaining many of the core features of what it was before, right? So just to kind of give a couple of examples, I think that what you really see here is a continuation of the domestic Reaganomic projects that you talked about that are intended to discipline the general population by cutting it off from a lot of mechanisms of social welfare and social security, while at the same time adopting a more autarkic approach to international economics. There's a very good book on this by an economic historian called Mark Palin, called Pax Economica, which argues actually that by and large it's been leftists and liberals who have been fierce proponents for things like free trade. He mentions even that Karl Marx was a proponent of free trade because he thought it was going to bring the world together. Engels was, Bernstein was, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, many libertarians, left libertarians, and anarchists like Bastiat also thought free trade was going to elevate ordinary people. And what Palin points out is that conservatives have always supported a kind of capitalism domestically, right? It's not like they ever wanted to move towards a more social democratic or socialist system, but they also deeply resented the notion of free trade that was advanced by many leftists and progressives. Why? Because they thought, well, free trade is going to make us dependent upon countries that bluntly we consider to be our inferiors, right? And not only is it going to make us dependent upon their goods, but we're also going to have to treat them on the basis of a kind of reciprocity, right? If we're going to trade with African nations and we're going to trade with them fairly, then we have to treat them like we would any other consumers, right? We give them something and in return they give us something back, right? And that was not the mindset, certainly according to Palin, that many conservatives wanted to adopt when it came to geopolitics. Their idea was, we are going to be the master, they are going to be the subordinates, and they're going to give us whatever it is that they want, or that we want. And the solution of 19th and early 20th century autarkists for this was empire, right? Basically saying, well, if we're not going to trade with the rest of the world, but we still want their goods, then we'll just expand everywhere, right? That was the goal of many German imperialists, Japanese imperialists, and for that many on the American far right as well, who wanted to be isolationist, but still maintain hemispheric control of, you know, Canada, Mexico, large parts of South America, right? And I think that qua Palin, what you really see is this view resurging under Trump, while combining with many, again, of the harsher aspects of Reaganomics. So what you have is not an isolationist United States, but a United States that really feels that it is now entitled to not be dependent in any way, shape on the world, but still incorporate a lot of the world's goods into its economy in ways that are advantageous to it. And if it needs to use American military muscle and power in order to achieve that, then so be it, right? And you've even seen Trump try to make gestures in the direction of just good old-fashioned American imperialism or over 19th century imperialism, saying we're going to annex Canada, we're going to annex Greenland, we're going to annex Panama Canal again, right? So far, we haven't seen that, and thank God, right? And, you know, at the same time, you know, just like there's kind of social Darwinism in the geopolitical world where big countries prey upon the weak, so too will there be social Darwinism domestically, right? Where the big fish will eat the little fish, and we don't want to provide any succor to so-called weak Americans who can't cut it in a competitive economy. And it's a very brutal, very harsh, and I think, frankly, very unrealistic view. And I say unrealistic because even though people have always preyed upon one another, the ideological justifications given for this, that it aligns with some kind of meritocracy or it reflects the elevation of the superior people, just doesn't really have a leg to stand for argumentatively once you start to break it down.
Yeah, no, the one thing about Trump, though, his economic nationalism is very sloppy, because when you look at the intellectual conservative and more progressive economic nationalism from EPI to American Compass of Warren Cass, and even, I mean, I'm small fry. I mean, I have 1,100 followers on Twitter, about 1,055 subscribers on my YouTube channel, but still, nevertheless.
Congratulations, by the way.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Still I'm out there. I have voluminous writings. Many have written about this through the U.S. Business and Industry Council, which used to exist, Coalition for Prosperous America. There are many think tanks, many activist organizations and intellectuals for decades that have written about this. The problem with the Trump administration, it's not an intellectually coherent plan.
Yep.
I would consider it a highly ineffective nationalism based on jingoism, and a very dumb jingoism. To go over the industrial policy, you need to have, in my opinion, select tariffs. You can't go 0 to 60. It has to be delicately negotiated. Our addiction to cheap labor and cheap goods, so-called cheap goods, took years, decades for us to get used to, and to wean ourselves off of a more balanced trade situation where we were largely, though not totally, self-sufficient on our own resources. It's going to take time to get us back to that point. Now, I am for international trade with free countries, with economic systems more or less similar to our own, mixed economies or capitalist economies, non-authoritarian states. And with that, you're still should have a degree of free trade, because that'll make us more competitive. If the country produces a better product like Japanese or South Korean automobiles, for example, that are very gas efficient and well built, that will provide the spur for our companies to produce good autos. Now, that's what the free trade libertarians and a lot of the conservative incorporated people and the corporate Democrats say. But when you look at the works like Chalmers Johnson or Parks Cobal's A Troubled Tiger, book about South Korean economic development, it's actually very statist, like almost, if by a conservative and libertarian definition, socialistic planning that was used. It was a cooperation of the private sector and control of the private sector, with sloths in the case of South Korea, nationalized banks and nationalized industries that are, you could argue, efficiently or effectively run, with a heavy export mercantilist emphasis of dumping products overseas. And they used a lot of anti-free market tools to attain market share in the United States. And we have to recognize those realities too as well. And that's why I've become more of an economic protectionist, because I looked at how the world actually operated, rather than the ideological special interest driven bullshit that was propounded by free traders of within the conservative camp, so-called, or the Democratic Party camp. And what you need to do is not only incremental tariffs that are also targeted, but what the Trump administration has incentivized in other areas is totally hostile to industrial development. You got to ban stock buybacks. This new tax bill does not disincentivize stock buybacks. Why would you make stock buybacks illegal? Well, it's in part because those profits will then be reinvested into opening new factories, hiring new staff, bonuses for workers when it's earned by those workers, etc. You would restore Glass-Steagall and other anti-speculative laws into place. You would put in laws banning, capital B, banning private equity, what used to be called leverage buyouts. That has ruined a number of companies. Look at Sunbeam, textbook example of the now defunct appliance maker. Or look at Sears Roebuck, Eddie Lampert, who used to lead that company as the CEO, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong. He was a devotee of Ayn Rand, ran the company into the ground, Sears, that is. So the financialization of the economy, which most so-called conservatives, and I hate to say it, a number of the corporate Democrats have been complicit, particularly under Clinton on this, President Clinton. The real enemy of reindustrialization is the hyper-financialization of the economy. And the Trump administration, when you look, again, you just look at the news stories, they're incentivizing on steroids predatory finance, unproductive speculation. So really, and I don't want to sound ableist, and I probably shouldn't use the R word because it's rude, but it just conveys my anger and distaste and contempt for Trump policy making. But it's just, I don't even want to say it's ridiculous, but it upsets me to no end, because really and truly, it's going to, unless there's a major course correction, I think the economy in the United States will collapse eventually. And you might think that I'm crazy. Well, there are wealthy people that are building bunkers. They're storing supplies, bunkers here in the United States as well as abroad in New Zealand. You have the infamous plutonomy memo from a few years back by Citibank and others, Tudor Investment. They all are, many are growing worried about the rising anti-capitalist sentiment, that they're worried that there could be a real social revolution in this country. Peter Thiel, to his credit, actually had stated in an email that was circulated online on X recently, where he actually expressed concern. He's like, look, whatever his sincerity is, I'm just glad he said it and recognize it, because there's a lot of the anti-communists that I talk with on the show, most of them do not understand it or flat out refuse to understand it, because there are many reasons why. But Thiel had stated that, look, people cannot buy houses, they cannot start families, and much of it is because of the capitalist system breaking down. And this is resulting in rising socialist sentiment. And instead of talking down to the younger generation, we need to think about potentially serious course corrections. And I want your honest opinion. I mean, Karl Marx said in the manifesto, in his Communist Manifesto, and I think it was absolutely correct, that the bourgeoisie are their own gravediggers. And in my interpretation, that's referring to the greed and the short-sightedness and the sociopathy of many within the super wealthy. Now, I'm not for getting rid of, quote, billionaires. I mean, even Bernie and Elizabeth Warren's tax plan from their last presidential runs actually does not abolish millionaires or billionaires, and I'm fine with that. But you also need avenues of social mobility. I am so sick and tired, Matt. I get angry, literally angry. Nothing triggers me more, and you answer these people beautifully. I want to literally reach into the computer screen of my phone or laptop and punch them. That's how angry I get. These social Darwinists who say, just pull yourself up by your bootstrap. No, it's not your fault or everything. Now, let me tell you, and I really get on these rants. Sorry to monopolize here, but the next candidate, if I had the money and if I knew that the country was favorable to my unique blend of anti-totalitarianism, anti-communism, anti-quote socialism, anti-fascism, for pre-Reagan capitalism, realizing conservative goals without shitting on immigrants and gay people and trans people and everything and whatnot. Here's one of my slogans. I will say to the working class and the poor, maybe a portion of the people experiencing homelessness and the small business people, especially people that struggle. Remember that movie, Good Will Hunting?
I do.
Remember where Robin Williams was showing the folder of Will Hunting's abuse and scars and bruises and gashes? And he reached over and he hugged him and he said, "It's not your fault. It's not your fault." We have to deprogram a portion of the American electorate by saying, what you're going through, you're working 2 jobs. It's not your fault. That would be my campaign slogan. I would have red hats that will say, "Make America Great. It's not your fault." T-shirts saying that. That's what I'm talking about. Do you think, what do you see in the future for the U.S. at this point? I hate to put you in the spot.
No, there's a few things I have to say in response to that, and then unfortunately I have to go because it's almost 10 o'clock. So you packed a lot into that comment. I think I'm just going to limit myself to 2 broad comments. The first one will be about the antagonisms you're talking about. And then I'll make a comment about what Marx might say about our contemporary economic situation, since you had asked about the Communist Manifesto. So I think in terms of people's feelings right now, it's very clear that people are angry, and not just in the United States, right? There's by and large been a crisis of legitimacy, as it's sometimes called, across many Western and indeed many developing states. Think about places like Brazil. Think about places like Mexico, which elected a left-wing government, Chile. Think about, France, which came very close to electing, the National Front, National Rally, Italy, you name it, right? And there's been an enormous amount of theorization and social scientific research done to try to ascertain why people are mad. But I'll just share a couple of results here. So the conservative political scientists, Martin Gilens and Eatwell, conducted a very long study about sentiments in the United Kingdom and the United States that led people to embrace right-wing populism. And what they found were a number of different variables, including education levels. But by and large, the reason why people embraced right-wing populism was the perception on their part that liberal or neoliberal elites from either party or whatever party it happens to be did not care very much about the interests of ordinary folk in the countries. And though they did care a lot more about cosmopolitan oligarchs and their interests, right? Now, Eatwell and Goodwin point out that the right broadly profited from these sentiments by directing a lot of these animosities towards things like cosmopolitan institutions, right? Globe-trotting liberals who happen to hang out in Davos, all that kind of thing. Although it's very possible, as they point out, that the left could have profited from it instead and still could, right? By generating a lot of animus towards oligarchs. And then you have other studies by people like Martin Gilens from 2012, 2014, or Thomas Piketty in his very large book, Capital and Ideology. Less well read than the Capital in the 21st Century book. And one of the things that both Gilens and Piketty point out is that this perception that neoliberal or political elites don't really care very much about ordinary people are completely grounded in reality. That's the really sad part, right? It's not like people are misreading the situation. It really is the case that regardless of what party is in power, the people who will always get policies passed that are in their interest are oligarchs, the 1%, really the 0.01%, and ordinary people, regardless of who they vote for, and no matter how they mobilize, their interests are not accommodated in our political system. Now, that is in a very lopsided way to run the country or run any number of countries. And you should not be surprised that when the perception matches this reality, people get really, really pissed off and they want someone to smash the system. Now, to your point about Trumpism, I think that Trump is as much a system figure as you possibly can imagine, right? And we've just seen that recently with the Big Beautiful Bill that constitutes one of the largest wealth transfers up in American history. And to your point about being mad, it pissed me the fuck off, right? I thought very often to myself, how dare you slash health benefits to poor people and food stamps for children so that you can give your billionaire buddy a little bit more money to buy his next yacht. But that's the world we live in, right? But you shouldn't be surprised that somebody benefited from a lot of these animuses, and Trump was just very skillful at manipulating that and targeting groups of people who were not oligarchs, but who could be the locus of a lot of that anger. And my secret theory, although I don't have the data to prove this, is I think a lot of Trump's blue-collar supporters, know deep down that really targeting migrants, racial minorities, isn't going to do an awful lot to improve their situation. But when you've been pissed off and you've been frustrated for such a long time, that anger has to go somewhere. And even if you might know that the oligarchs are really the big problem, they're very powerful, they're very well entrenched, and they can very much fight back. So why not pick on the people who are close by, who might not be directly responsible, but who can be the whipping boys for a lot of those antagonisms. So again, that's purely speculation on my part. I have no data to back that up aside from anecdotal conversations. So that's my comment about the state of political legitimacy in the United States. On the Marxist point, right? Look, I don't want to do a long divulgence on Marxist economics, right? Which I should say is also a field that's come back into vogue somewhat, right? Now, I think that there are a lot of problems with Marx's economic theory, not least the labor theory of value, which I think has just been very legitimately criticized and is unsustainable, even if a lot of stuff that he says about exploitation has been satisfactorily reconstructed by other Marxist theorists, like J. Cohen, for example. That's something that a lot of people know, right? But one of Marx's key insights that I do think is very relevant today is about the way that capitalism engenders certain ways of looking at the world in different groups that can become very damaging since people aren't aware holistically of the impact of their behaviors on the economy. Just to give one example related to crises of underconsumption, which is what you're gesturing to, Marx says, look, the reality is that most capitalists aren't actually all that concerned about a workers' revolution day in and day out, because they have what they consider to be much bigger fish to fry, which is their competitors, right? They spend most of their time worried about what other capitalists are going to do. So they tend to perceive the people who are working for them appropriately as workers, not as potential threats. And consequently, one of their ambitions is to pay them as wages that are roughly as low as possible in order to get an edge over the other guy, and also to hemorrhage their economic might into political might so they can gain advantages for themselves, right? A lot of people don't like hearing this, but Adam Smith said that this is exactly what capitalists do all the way back in the wealth of nations, right? The merchants will never gather together unless it is as part of a conspiracy against the public that is not in the public's interest, right?
Right.
So, just go look at the father of capitalism. He was aware this is a problem, right? And now Marx says, when the system is operating reasonably well, all the things kind of chug along. But the problem is, of course, that the workers of each individual capitalist are not just workers. They are also the consumers of the goods that they produce and the consumers of everyone else's goods. You got to sell to someone, right? And if every capitalist is doing the best they can to depress wages and hemorrhaging their political might in order to depress the overall standard of living, the reality is that nobody's going to actually have the income to buy things any longer. You're getting that, right? You can't buy a house any longer. Fuck it, I can barely afford to live in a one-bedroom apartment at this point, right? And many other people are in the same situation. I get a regular paycheck, and this inevitably, according to Marx, is going to generate enormous kinds of problems down the line. Because if the workers can't actually buy the things that they produce, then you're going to have a crisis of underconsumption, right? There are more goods available than what people can afford, and that's going to bring about potential forms of insecurity, right? Now, Marx was one of the first to point out that there are ways that capitalists can kind of try to fix these problems. And later Marxists will point out things like the introduction of cheap and readily available credit through credit cards is one way that people have tried to offset this problem, right?
David Harvey, the British Marxist, has pointed that out, actually. Yeah, go ahead. He's done some very good work on that.
Exactly, and I think that's absolutely correct, right? But Harvey's point is just to say, well, that doesn't solve the problem. It just pushes it further down the line, and it means that you're probably going to have a bigger crisis when it inevitably arises, because now not only do people still not have the money they need in order to buy the products they produce, but they owe tens of thousands of dollars to a credit card company that they're never going to be able to pay back, right? And this Marxist insight has been picked up whether directly by, whether it was a direct influence or not is debated by people like John Maynard Keynes and many other macroeconomists, right, who have consistently pointed out that, look, it is not the case that each individual person pursuing their self-interest will always bring about a harmonious economic system as long as they are left alone. Sometimes when people pursue their self-interest without regard for everyone else, because they're not aware of the effects that their actions have on others, it can bring about really big problems, right? What the solution to those problems should be is where a lot of the debate is, right? Should the state intervene? How much should it intervene? Should it offer something like jobs guarantee? But this is where I would come in with my argument for, again, something like the Nordic model on steroids, as it was, because I think that there's nothing wrong with markets per se in producing or in organizing things like the production and distribution of consumer goods, right? I think that if we look at the experience of the Soviet Union, for example, it's been pretty satisfactorily proven that a command economic or a nationalist system that tries to produce consumer goods does a very bad job of it, because we can never know day in and day out whether people want more donuts or whether they want more cupcakes or whether people want TVs or cell phones, right? You kind of have to let markets do their job there, right? But I think that there's no reason that couldn't decommodify large parts of the economy, particularly starting with healthcare, which every other rich country does anyway, right? And the United States now pays the most for healthcare and gets some of the worst results, right? So there's a pretty clear argument for doing that there. And then we can move forward in the future to see what other kind of spheres that we might be able to modify. Post-secondary education is another one that I could think of.
Yeah, no, there's a lot I agree with. I know we're running out of time. Matt, where can people find your essays, your published work, published books, etc.?
Sure. If people want, my big recent book is The Political Theory of Liberal Socialism that came out back in late November. I have a new essay collection coming out with Dr. Ben Burgess soon on G.A. Cohen, the analytical Marxist who I mentioned, where I argue actually that he doesn't really satisfactorily answer some liberal objections, right? So I kind of push on him from that direction. And I'm working on some other stuff for outlets like Liberal Currents, Commonwealth Magazine. People can just keep an eye on those, and it'll be coming out soon. But if they want to keep an eye on what I'm doing, add me on Twitter or Blue Sky at MattPaulProf, or just send me an email at mattmcmanus300@gmail.com. I'm happy to respond to relatively short questions.
Great. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Matt. We're probably going to have many more conversations in the future. Good luck with the move. Be safe. And I look forward to our next conversation.
Thank you very much, Nevin. Always a pleasure.
Alrighty. Be well. Let's see. Oops.